In this lecture, I'll be discussing terrorism and looking at state responses to terrorism. In this intro slide here, you can see some of the responses of the state of China to terrorism, or in attempts to get prepared for terrorism. These are all terrorist preparedness exercises associated in and around the Olympics in Beijing. So some of the bigger questions to think about is what exactly constitutes terrorism? Is one person's terrorist another person's freedom fighter, or might there be a more objective way to define terrorism and begin to analyze it and think about it in the global sphere? What have been the impacts of terrorist attacks? And certainly we saw this in the last lecture's discussion of militarization in a variety of contexts within society as a whole. I'll start with a discussion of terrorism in general, drawing from Lawrence Kunzar's work, Rationality, Wars, and the War on Terror. From there, I'll go into a discussion of the extent of terrorism globally, and we'll focus, for the most part, on the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, looking at the differences in how these attacks were received by differently situated publics. Both place, race, and gender matter in how individuals interpret the attacks of September 11th in the United States. Lawrence Kunzar's 2007 Rationality, Wars, and the War on Terror looks at terrorism and social unrest. And what he attempts to do in this piece is come up with or utilize a definition of terrorism that has been utilized at the international level. He notes that the term terrorism comes from the French Revolution, and through published definitions, there's a general understanding of terrorism that is essentially three components. First, it's a tactic utilized by groups of individuals who oppose stronger political or military organizations by asymmetrically weak groups to target non-combatants for death, injury, and property destruction. And finally, it is used to intimidate and put political pressure on dominant organizations. Kunzar does mention that the state can engage in state-sponsored terror, but this is different than terrorism under international definitions. Terrorism, the definition, can be applied consistently and scientifically even if governments use the definition or in their application use this somewhat arbitrarily. Causes of terrorism from the literature range from descriptions of poverty, failed states, humiliation, relative poverty, religion, and cultural clashes. Lawrence Kunzar suggests that terrorists are in fact rational actors, and he develops this using the sigmoid utility curve. Terrorists are in fact rational, full awareness of what they're doing and the resources. They have self-interested motives, and they conduct essentially cost-benefit analysis in order to maximize one's satisfaction. Typically, when we think about maximization of utility or satisfaction, we think about this in the context of the individual. The economically rational individual will make decisions which will benefit him or her. However, this is culturally based, as Kunzar points out, and utility is in fact overall based on the social environment within which one finds oneself. This could be a very individualistic level, but it also could be looking at different levels of group organization. And so we see with Kunzar's work in his application of the sigmoid utility curve that the reference point for those involved in the terrorist attacks of 9/11 is within the cell or group itself. That is, they do not reflect the larger opinions of an organized religion or society, including the nation state or state, but rather they are rather specific to a particular group of individuals who are organized specifically to engage in terrorist activity. Hence, relative prestige along the lines of social status or wealth is measured not by reference to the larger society, but to and within the social group or the terror cell. He notes, utilizing the sigmoid utility curve, that individuals will tend to join and participate where they can maximize their utility and minimize their loss. Hence, it's those individuals who have much to gain by participation and relatively little to lose that will choose to participate in terrorist activities. Kunzar has used this sigmoid utility model in a variety of cross-cultural contexts. And in his analysis of the co-conspirators of the 9/11 attacks, he finds that 17 of the 19 co-conspirators in the 9/11 attacks indeed fall within the sigmoid utility curve. So the model fits for explaining the behavior of 17 of the 19 co-conspirators in the attacks of September 11th, 2001. So thinking about Kunzar's and others' definition of terrorism, we can look at the statistics on terrorism and consider this in light of what has become the war on terror. And you can see here from this figure, which comes from the Institute for Economics and Peace, that there has been an upswing in the number of terrorist attacks across the globe, numbering at about 17,000 total deaths which have been caused by terrorist attacks in 2013. They note that the number of people who have died from terrorist activity has increased fivefold since the year 2000. If you look at the statistics from the same organization, the Institute for Economics and Peace, you can see that across the globe there is a wide variety in terms of the impacts of terrorism. The states that are represented in the darker colors on this map have higher rates of incidence of terrorism and have the highest impact of terrorist activities. As they point out, this is mostly situated in 5 countries. So in thinking about probably one of the biggest events of the last couple decades, we can see the attacks of September 11th, 2001 that were designed to attack key sites of both economic and political power, military might within the United States. So the question, a lot of scholars, of course, have talked about September 11th, whether this is a distinct moment in time, the idea that America is no longer a safe haven and is rather a place where anything could happen next. Is this, in fact, the beginning of history or a rupture overall? Is this a break within history? Certainly, we saw in the last lecture on militarism the formation of new landscapes, ideologies, as well as normative behavior, and a real struggle between notions of structure and freedom in terms of laws that are either protecting the rights of citizens or encouraging the responsibility of citizens or monitoring said responsibility through surveillance. There were a number of questions about why these attacks happened. Some of the pop song, one of the pop songs of this was Alan Jackson's "Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning?" And in this particular song, he talks about the idea of just a common guy who doesn't really know all that much about Iraq and Iran, even though he's watching the news on a regular basis. Now, the attacks of September 11th, 2001 have been framed in a number of different ways, and positioning matters quite a bit. As the political leaders of the United States attempted to frame the attacks of September 11th as attacks on fundamental freedoms, particularly George W. Bush's presidential address of September 20th, 2001, just a few short days after the terrorist attacks. He noted the explanation for why the terrorist attacks occurred, noting that it revolved around the idea of freedom. He said they hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. Now, this is markedly different from what his Attorney General, from what the U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft said just a few short months later on December 11th, 2001. He said, "To those who put Americans against immigrants and citizens against non-citizens." And here he was specifically referencing a lot of the particular attacks on particular segments of the population. But this point I think here is interesting, this next one, and I think it's fundamentally against what George W. Bush was getting at when he noted that part of freedom was the ability to disagree with each other. Ashcroft continues, "To those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and diminish our resolve. They give ammunition to America's enemy and pause to America's friends." So here Ashcroft refers to those who are scaring peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty. If one is scaring a peace-loving person, this would indicate that they themselves are not a peace-loving person. And the idea that these are phantoms of lost liberty, that liberty has not truly been lost. I believe Ashcroft is referring here specifically to the resistance to the USA Patriot Act and those that have been critical with the USA Patriot Act and its relatively quick movement through both houses of Congress and being signed into the law. He notes here that resistance, or the idea of disagreement, is perhaps not permissive because it actually aids terrorists. It only aids terrorists because it erodes our national unity and diminishes our resolve. So there's this sense from Ashcroft, as well as former President Bush, of this idea of national unity and this idea of peace and peace-loving and free individuals. But as anthropologists have demonstrated, it depends quite a bit from where individuals are situated within social hierarchies, how they will read the events of September 11th. Jacobs-Ewing, in her 2006 piece, looks at African American responses in comedy clubs. And it certainly is true that you can say quite a bit more in a joke than you can say seriously. These jokes were very specific. They were successful when they were in African American comedy clubs and less successful when they went out to other audiences as a whole. And so some of the jokes revolved around the idea that white people were getting African Americans in trouble again, that white people were passive, what happened to the white people as a whole who had not been passive in the past, who had in fact enslaved Africans and dispossessed and killed Native Americans, that they would not in fact have been scared with the weapons that the terrorists brandished on the plane. Also jokes about white people being suspects now, getting pulled out of line, and noting that this is somehow different than in the past, whereas racial profiling in the past seemingly only worked one way, now everyone was a potential suspect, including white people. They also point out that the benefits that accrued to African Americans were a result of the movement away of rights of Arab Americans as a whole, and the idea of full citizenship, that African Americans only get to be full citizens when the United States as a whole wanted something from them. So Jacobs-Ewing works with Mattingly and Lawler, and they do a series of focus groups in Los Angeles, and these focus groups are groups of 8 to 12 women who are sitting around and talking about particular issues of concern to them. They're undirected focus groups, which means there are no prompts to start them out. And Mattingly, Lawler, and Jacobs-Ewing go ahead and record these focus groups and what participants are saying, and then do a content analysis of it. And what they find is that September 11th, the events of September 11th, 2001, the attacks on the World Trade Center, Pentagon, and Congress, were in fact 3,000 miles away. And they were a really discrete moment in time, and they didn't really fundamentally change anything in the everyday lives of individuals.